Following the collapse of the Mycenaean Greece at the end of the 12th century BCE, the whole region entered the period known as the Greek Dark Ages. The main characteristic of this era is the absence of the written records, as the previous Mycenaean writing system, known as the linear B script, ceased to exist during the turmoil that eventually put an end to the Bronze Age in Hellas. As the final Mycenaean king Tisamenes was defeated and the citadel of Mycenae sacked, the Heracleid conquerors divided Peloponnese into their own spheres of influence. Out of the three brothers, the eldest, Temenus, received the area of Argolis, where he declared himself the king of Argos. His younger brother, Crespontes, received Messenia, from where he expelled the members of the Narrated dynasty who were forced to flee away and eventually settle in Athens. The third brother, Aristodemus, did not live to see the reward of the Heracleid conquest, as he died before the campaign was completed. His death is usually attributed to a storm at Naupactus that had prevented the initial Heracleid landing on the Peloponnese. It was said that Aristodemus was either struck by lightning or fatally shot by god Apollo as the result of Heracleid leaders disobeying the Olympian gods. Another version of the story, however, has it that Aristodemus did in fact arrive to Peloponnese and proceeded with conquest together with his brothers. It was only as he was making his way through the mountainous region of Arcadia that Aristodemus was assassinated by the Achaeans. Either way, Aristodemus's two twin sons, Eurysthenes and Procles, lived on and were thus bestowed the region of Lacedaemon. As the two brothers were still babies at the time, the settlement process was carried out by their uncle Theras, who was granted regency until the two boys reached adulthood. Theras was a prince from Thebes, a son of the Theban king Euthecian, a Heracleid ally during the Peloponnesian conquest. Euthecian's daughter and Theras' sister Argaea was married to late Aristodemus, and now as a widow arrived to Laconia together with her twin sons. The Heracleid forces, chiefly consisting of the Dorians from the region of Doris, thus arrived to the deserted Lacedaemon, finding only the ruins of the Mycenaean Sparta, which had been already abandoned over the course of the past century. The only site of significance among the Spartan remnants was Menelaon, a shrine dedicated to the legendary king Menelaus and his wife Helen, where the locals from the surrounding areas still came to pay tribute. The Dorians, led by Regent Theras, thus settled in an area nearby, and villages on the western flank of the Eurotas River, opposite Menelaon and the ruins of the Bronze Age Sparta. These villages likely numbered no more than several hundred people, which only shows that the Dorian settlement in Laconia was not any type of a grand conquest or an invasion, but rather a modest affair with no great initial significance to the surrounding regions. During the 11th century BCE, the two main Dorian villages were Pitani and Limnae, established around a hill that would later become the Spartan Acropolis. The local chieftains of these villages were originally, according to the legend, none other than the Heracleid twins Eurysthenes and Procles. As the two boys reached adulthood, Theras was relieved of his regency and thus proceeded to lead another Dorian colony, this time to an island of the old Minoan center of Akrotiri, which was after him named Thera. In Lacedaemon, besides Pitani and Limnae, two more villages were soon founded, namely Kinosura and Messoa, forming the core Dorian territory in Laconia. These early Dorian settlements shared the cult of goddess Artemis with an important local festival. A nearby village of Therapne, which used to be a part of the Mycenaean Sparta, was also added to the Dorian sphere of influence, which slowly began its local expansion. Besides the Dorian settlements, however, the region of Laconia and even Lacedaemon itself numbered several Achaean towns which had survived the Mycenaean collapse. Chief among the Lacedaemonian settlements was the town of Amyclae, a local Achaean holding which did not look upon the Dorians with a friendly eye. Upon the Heracleid arrival, Amyclae was originally bestowed to Philonomus, a local Achaean noble who through treachery enabled the Dorians to settle in Sparta. Amyclae was thus allowed to preserve its Achaean population in addition to the settlers from Imbros and Lemnos, which Philonomus brought in to increase the size of the town. Further south were the Achaean towns of Pharis, Geronthra and Helos, while to the north, the region of Arcadia was home to many Achaean refugees following the Mycenaean collapse, as due to its mountainous and remote terrain, it remained untouched by the Heracleidae and their Dorian allies. During the 10th century BCE, the Dorian settlements grew in size, eventually coming to a conclusion that the existence of a stronger polity was necessary in order to successfully manage the local affairs. The village of Pitani thus eventually merged with the nearby Limnae, Messoa and Kinesura, and thus gave birth to the Dorian city-state of Lacedaemon. The name Sparta itself referred to the site consisting of the original 4 villages that constituted the polis, together with its acropolis that stood in its center. On the other hand, the name Lacedaemon was the official name of the polis, which also controlled the surrounding area, including the Mycenaean era site of Menelaon. The first Spartan ruler of the time was King Agis I from Pitani, who founded the Ageid dynasty, the more senior of the 2 royal houses of Sparta. In many of the ancient records, Agis was considered to have been a son of Eurysthenes, one of the 2 original Heracleid rulers in Lacedaemon. However, as the time disparity between Agis and his supposed father was about 100 years, it is rather possible that Agis would have been one of Eurysthenes' descendants and not literally his son. The other royal house, tracing their lineage to Eurysthenes' twin brother Procles, was based in the neighboring village of Limnae. Despite the same time disparity, the son of Procles was said to have been a chieftain named Soas, a contemporary and likely a co-king of Agis. The dynasty of Procles' successors, however, was called the Eurypontid dynasty, after Soas' son Eurypon. Subsequently, the 2 dynasties went on to rule the polis of Sparta jointly, establishing the famed Spartan diarchy, a political system of 2 co-kings that persisted in Lacedaemon for centuries, well into the Hellenistic times. Although the Dorians were considered to have arrived to Peloponnese during the collapse of the Mycenaean Greece, the historical and archaeological records offer little to no distinction between the Peloponnesian inhabitants in the early phases of the Greek Dark Ages. The true emergence of this ancient Greek tribe in Laconia, however, as well as consolidation of its identity, is according to many accounts tied to the reign of the Spartan king Agis I. Different dates had been proposed for the reign of Agis, who according to the semi-mythological accounts reigned in the 11th century BCE and was a son of Eurysthenes, the ancestor of what would soon become the Ageid dynasty of Sparta. However, this early timeline almost definitely does not correspond to the historical record and was likely invented in the ancient times in order to directly tie King Agis to his Heracleid ancestors, ignoring more than a century-long period of the Dorian Spartan formation of the early Dark Ages. Modern scholars, considering the archaeological evidence that does in fact match the definite rise of Dorians in Lacedaemon, as well as the reign dates of the later Spartan kings, date the beginning of King Agis' reign to approximately 930 BCE. Being the eponymous ruler of the elder of the two royal houses of Sparta, King Agis was credited with unifying the four Lacedaemonian villages, Pitani, Limnae, Messoa, and Cynosura, into a single polis, and thus refounding the city of Sparta. Although many consider Agis to have preceded the dual monarchy and thus ruled as the sole king of Sparta, later classical authors such as Ephorus include a figure named Soas as Agis' co-king, representing what would later become the Europontid royal house. Ever since the Dorian arrival to the Peloponnese and their settlement in Laconia, there seemed to have been little to no difference between the incoming settlers and the remnants of the autochthonous Achaean population. According to the legend, when the Heracleidae arrived to the region with their Dorian allies, Eurysthenes and Procles did not subjugate the Achaeans, but simply founded the Dorian enclaves that continued to coexist with the Achaean population inhabiting the nearby towns and villages. However, all of that was about to change with Agis, who ought to use the Dorian population rallied behind him in order to expand his power and subsequently make Dorians the masters of Lacedaemon. The Achaean inhabitants were thus given two options. One was to accept the second-class status under the Dorian hegemony, and the second was to leave Sparta and settle somewhere else. Faced with such situation, many Achaeans opted to move north to Arcadia, a mountainous region which, due to its remoteness, managed to survive the Mycenaean collapse almost intact. Arcadians themselves were also ethnically Achaean and were happy to receive the Lacedaemonian exiles, slowly but surely building the animosity towards the Spartans, with the first signs of hostility already visible between the two regions. The first skirmish would soon occur, as a small Spartan force apparently attempted an incursion into Arcadia. The Lacedaemonian regiment was reportedly led by Agis' co-king Soas, but soon upon entering the hostile territory, learned of the difficulties of fighting the Arcadians. As Soas' troops advanced further, they were confronted by the Clitorian force that marched out to meet the invaders. The Spartans, unfamiliar with the difficult and remote terrain, were soon encircled by the Clitorians, finding themselves in a dry and stony place with no access to water. In such dire situation, the encircled Spartans opened negotiations with the Arcadians, with King Soas pledging to abandon the campaign, provided that himself and all of his men should drink water from the nearby spring. After the deal was reached, the Spartans were provided passage to the spring. King Soas, however, considering his troops to now have a slightly better ground, tried to convince his soldiers not to drink water from the spring, so that they would not be obliged by the deal they just made with the Arcadians. The Spartan soldiers, however, apparently being on the verge of collapse at this point, were not persuaded by their king, and all of them proceeded to drink. Soas himself, still not willing to yield, only sprinkled his face, but ultimately decided not to drink water, and thus declared that the pledge he made to the Arcadians did not bound him and his army, because not everybody ended up drinking the water. As the Clitorians approached, King Soas, still not willing to budge, rallied his men and charged against the Arcadians. The fate of Soas and his army is not known, but it is clear that Spartans had little to no success in these early incursions against the Achaean towns of Arcadia. Those Achaeans that chose not to leave Sparta, however, were reduced to a non-citizen inhabitants that would later come to be known as Perioikoi. Furthermore, according to Ephorus, Pindar, and Herodotus, among others, King Agis would go on to conduct further conquest of the neighboring Achaean cities to the south, most notably the city of Amyclae. As his army took Amyclae and its Achaean population supposedly submitting to Agis, the king continued his march southwards towards the coastal city of Hellas. Unlike the people of Amyclae, the Helots refused to submit to the Spartan king and instead prepared for battle. This decision by the citizens of Hellas did not sit well with the Spartan king, who decided to make an example of the defiant city and push his policies to the fullest extent. As the army of Hellas sallied out to battle the troops of Agis, it proved to be no match for the Spartans, and the city of Hellas was eventually subdued. Subsequently, the Spartan king enslaved the indigenous population, thus creating the first Helots, the famous state-owned slaves of the Spartan society. Other historians, however, disagree with the notion that it was Agis I that had conquered Amyclae and enslaved Helots, as Sparta did not appear to have been that powerful that early on. According to Pausanias, the Spartan conquests of Amyclae and Hellas took place in the 8th century BCE, about 200 years after the reign of Agis. Either way, it is entirely possible that Agis did conduct operations against his neighbors, and although perhaps not outright conquering, at least forced the Laconian towns to accept some kind of local supremacy or influence of Sparta over its neighboring settlements. The estimated end of King Agis' reign came at about 900 BCE, when he was succeeded by his son Achestratus. The son and successor of Agis' co-king Soas, Eurypon, would be Achestratus' co-ruler and would eventually give name to the Europontid royal house in Sparta.
Following the death of King Agis I, the city-state of Sparta was left in firm Dorian hands. The surrounding settlements, especially those to the north on the road to Arcadia, were now Spartan dependencies, inhabited by the so-called Perioikoi, roughly meaning the dwellers around. The Perioikoi, being of Achaean origin, although free, were still considered non-citizen inhabitants of Laconia, below the Dorian Spartans themselves, who enjoyed full citizen privileges. Agis' son and successor Achestratus now represented the Aegean royal house, while his counterpart and Soas' son Eurypon became the head of what was at the time still called the House of Procles. Unlike Soas, however, Eurypon was much more than a co-king to Achestratus, and it would be during his reign that his royal house was put on a more equal standing with the Agiads, the elder of the two dynasties. It is understood that during these early times, the Spartan dual monarchy rested solely on the power of the two kings. Each ruler, surrounded by the immediate members of his dynasty, exercised absolute control over his chief settlement, which in the case of Agiad house was Pitani, while the descendants of Procles controlled Limnae. As the Agiad dynasty was considered the elder of the two, it certainly exercised more influence, especially early on, with the towns of Mesoa and Kinosura likely under the Agiad sway. Thus it comes as no surprise that many of the early sources did not even mention Soas, but regarded Agis as the sole king of Sparta at the time of its emergence. Eurypon was not only a king, but also a skilled politician as well as a demagogue, and was thus set to change the existing imbalance of power between the two houses. This was to be accomplished by a set of reforms, totally unexpected for this early period. In the words of Plutarch, Eurypon appears to have been the first king to relax the exercise absolutism of his sway, seeking favor and popularity with the multitude. Although the famous Spartan institutions such as Gerousia and Apella would not be established until later, Eurypon seemed to have founded an early form of a limited assembly or a council, which was able to elect some of the Spartan elders in charge of particular matters, taking over certain responsibilities previously held by a king. As we don't have any further information on these reforms, it is difficult to tell if these early magistrates held legislative, judicial, or executive powers, and how exactly were they chosen. What we do know is that an early oligarchy was taking root in Sparta and would later evolve to in some ways equal and sometimes even exceed powers held by the kings themselves. It is unknown how Eurypon's counterpart Echestratus reacted to this, but it's possible that he had complied, as any attempt to reverse this process would have likely alienated the king not only from a fellow co-ruler, but also from now increasingly important Spartan elders and much of the population. Moreover, no source records any internal unrest dating to this period, suggesting that the transition went smoothly, with the two kings still sharing majority of the power between themselves. Either way, this move brought much renown and prestige to Eurypon, who was reported to have been held in such high regard by the Spartans that his royal house came to be named after himself. According to Pausanias, the Procles, son of Aristodemus, called his son Soas, whose son Eurypon they say reached such pitch of renown that his house, Pietro called the Proclidae, came to be named after him, the Eurypontidae. Besides being a great politician, Eurypon also proved himself a skillful military commander. As the hostilities with the Arcadians did not cease since the time of Agis and Soas, with both of those kings possibly falling victim in the conflict according to different accounts, Sparta found itself in a prolonged war with many of the neighboring towns to the north. Although the chronology of the Spartan conquest of the Arcadian border regions remains unclear, attempts were certainly made to seize a rugged but strategically important area of Skiritis. The region of Skiritis consisted of small but inhospitable territory that provided passages to both Arcadia to the north and Cunuria to the east. It was inhabited by the Skiritae, a people of Arcadian origin living in three towns, Skyros, Oion, and Cariae, originally subject to the nearby city of Tegea. Nevertheless, the Spartan army moved north in attempt to seize this strategic region and finally end the war against the Arcadians. Although the Sciritae were ferocious warriors, they could not hold the numerically superior Spartan army, and in the absence of a major involvement from the neighboring Tegea, the whole area capitulated to the Spartans. As Sciritus was apparently taken, its towns were made subjects to Sparta, and inhabitants given similar status to the Perioikoi. However, unlike the other Spartan subjects, the Sciritae, given their military frontier nature, would be incorporated into the Spartan army as a special light infantry unit supporting the main Spartan force. Although there is no precise information on the battle and who exactly led the Spartan force, Euripon was specifically named in dealing with further Arcadian issue, while Echestratus made moves into Kinuria to the east. As hostilities with the Arcadians were still ongoing, it appears that the city of Mantinea and not Tegea was still in war with the Spartans. Euripon was determined to put an end to it on his own terms. According to Polyeanus, Euripon, king of the Lacedaemonians, found that the war which he had undertaken against the Arcadians was lasting longer than he had expected. In order to sow dissension amongst the Arcadians, he sent a herald to inform them that the Lacedaemonians would end the war if they banished those who were guilty of killing Agis. Therefore those who had been responsible for the death of Agis banded together to avoid being punished by the people as the price of peace. They won the support of the slaves through the promise of their freedom and put to death all of their opponents. After the people had been divided into two factions in this way, the party who were in favor of peace assembled in a particular quarter of the city of Mantinea and threw open the gates to the enemy. And so by their help, the Lacedaemonians obtained what they had been unable to achieve by the force of arms. While it is not specified whether the Spartans entered Mantinea or Agis' killers were simply extradited, it remains highly unlikely that the Spartan army was able to penetrate this deep into Arcadia during the Dark Ages, so the whole story could have been a later Spartan propaganda or a vastly exaggerated event of Spartans making peace with the Arcadians after years of hostilities. In the meantime, Echestratus decided to conduct a military operation of his own. The region of Kinuria to the east, although independent, was considered by the city of Argos to be in their own sphere of influence. Echestratus, wanting to present himself as an ally of Argos, a fellow Dorian city, alleged that freebooters from Kinuria were raiding and looting the Argive territory to the north. With seemingly no consent of approval from the Argives, the Spartan king decided to conduct a raid of his own. As the Spartan army invaded, the Kinurians were very likely caught by surprise and unable to mount any meaningful defense. Echestratus' raid was said to have been brutal, with Spartans killing all Kinurian men of military age that they found in the area. The true reason of this action remains unknown, as it could have been a preemptive action in order to cripple a potential adversary near the recently captured area of Sciritis. Either way, these actions would have long-term consequences, as it marked the beginning of continuous animosity with the city of Argos. After all, Kinurians were said to be of Argive origin, and with the Argive aspirations of expansion, the root of rivalry between the two emerging Peloponnesian powers was already created. Euripon was said to have ruled until either 890 or 860, while Echestratus ruled until 870 BCE. What these two kings left to their successors was a Sparta stronger than it was in the previous century, but also increasingly surrounded by adversaries, some of them looking to protect their independence, while others looking to expand in the direction of Lacedaemon and face Sparta head-on.
In 870 BCE, Labotas succeeded his father Agesilaus as the Spartan king, representing the Achaean dynasty. His counterpart and Eurypon's son, Pausanias, was said to have ascended to the Eurypontid throne in the following years, around 860 BCE. While not much is recorded about the rule of these two Spartan kings, the state of Lacedaemon found itself in a much stronger position than in the previous generations. The Arcadian border of Sciritis was now subdued, together with the surrounding areas inhabited by the Periarchoi, while Sparta also likely held a hegemonic position over their neighbors in Laconia. However, although becoming larger and stronger than before, the Spartan state was now surrounded by the increasingly unfriendly and in some cases hostile neighbors. To their west, the Spartans bordered the region of Mycenaean, which, although ruled by the same line of Heracleid kings that were related to the Spartan rulers themselves, was increasingly becoming pro-Achaean and anti-Dorian. The Dorian Spartans were growing more and more unhappy about their Dorian counterparts in Mycenaean being relegated to an underclass by the very cousins of Spartans' own royal dynasties that had together conquered the territory from the Achaeans in the past. To the north of Lacedaemon, the Arcadian cities were still holding a grudge over the recent hostilities, and to the northeast, the city-state of Argos was furious over Agesilaus' deadly raid in Kinuria. The Argives considered themselves to be the foremost of the Heracleid city-states, which in Peloponnese traditionally included Argos, Sparta, and Messenia. After all, it was Temenus, the eldest of the Heracleid brothers, that came to rule Argos, while his younger brothers and their descendants were given the other two respective states. According to the legendary lot of Temenus, after the defeat of the final Mycenaean king, much of the Peloponnesian territories were to be split by the three Heracleid brothers that led the conquering force, namely Temenus, Crespontes, and Aristodemus. As the brothers drew lots to determine who will receive which realm, Crespontes drew the region of Messenia, where he built his new capital, Stheneclarus. Aristodemus in turn did not live to see the end of the war, so his realm, which was drawn to be Lacedaemon, was assigned to his two twin sons, Eurysthenes and Procles, the ancestors of the two royal houses of Sparta. Temenus himself received Argolis, the core territory of the former Mycenaean kingdom. He established his capital in Argos, which was to incorporate not only the region of Argolis, but also Kinuria, as well as the entire eastern Laconian coast, including the island of Kythera further south. About 2 centuries later, Sparta did not only expand its borders, but was also conducting raids into Kinuria, a territory that the Argives considered to be firmly under their own hegemony. Such Spartan actions were unacceptable. While there is little evidence that the Argives in the Dark Ages were able to exercise control of the territories claimed by the lot of Temenus, Argos did appear to pursue an expansionist policy from early on, connecting them to the establishment of the Dorian rule in the surrounding regions, such as Sicyon and Corinth to the north. Kinuria, however, was considered by the Argives to be their doorstep, a red line where any foreign influence was more than undesirable. The Argive army was set to move, with a plan to annex Kinuria for themselves. As the Argive army entered Kinuria under a pretext of protection, they advanced through the region and even captured some parts of the country that were previously taken by the Spartans. Furthermore, these Argive actions also appeared to have instigated revolts of Periarchoi inside areas that were further into the Spartan territory, something that was unacceptable to the Lacedaemonians. According to Pausanias, it was then that the Lacedaemonians first resolved to make war upon the Argives, bringing as charges against them that they were annexing the Kinurian territory which they themselves had captured, and were causing revolts among their subjects, the Periarchoi. On this occasion, neither of the belligerents, according to the account, achieved anything worthy of mention. We do not know the details of this early Spartan-Argive conflict, other than it served as a catalyst for the long-standing animosity between the two city-states that would last through many centuries. It is said that Labotas ruled until 840 BCE, when he was succeeded by his son, Dorian. Prytanis, in turn, died in 830 BCE and was succeeded by his son, Polydectes. The new pair of Spartan kings faced the same problem as their predecessors, an overall unfriendly environment and a continuing war against Argos. Unlike Sparta, the Argive monarchy existed only in name by this time, as the local aristocracy really held the true political power, while the role of Argive kings was relegated to mostly ceremonial and religious responsibilities. The Argive aristocrats were predictably anti-Spartan and pushed for further confrontational stance against Lacedaemon. As the hostilities soon resumed, yet another battle or series of battles took place in 820 BCE, with King Dorian of the Achaean house leading the Spartan army. Little detail is given about the outcome of the conflict, except that Sparta apparently suffered considerable losses. King Dorian was among the fallen. Such consecutive deaths of the Spartan kings in wars against the Argives represented severe blow to the Spartan reputation, both domestically and among their regional rivals. Their western neighbors, the Mycenaeans, were emboldened to further pursue the anti-Dorian policies, and even in Laconia, the Spartan hegemony was in question among those cities that were still not fully subjugated, such as Amyclae and Helos. Something had to change. In 820 BCE, deceased Dorian was succeeded by his son, Agesilaus I. The reign of Agesilaus would bring significant changes to the Spartan society, but not necessarily caused by Agesilaus himself, nor one of his co-rulers. The end of the 9th and the beginning of the 8th century BCE signifies the end of the period we know as the Dark Ages, not only in Sparta but across the Hellenic world. It was about this time that Greek alphabet was introduced based on the Phoenician writing system, thus ending the nearly 4 centuries long period of illiteracy in Greece and marking the start of the Archaic era. However, in Sparta itself, the appearance of the alphabet would be overshadowed by yet another development, even more crucial to its society and overall Spartan way of life. It was the appearance of Lycurgus, the great Spartan lawgiver, whose reforms would forever transfer Sparta from yet another Hellenic city-state into a militaristic society, famed and feared by many across the pages of history. Make sure to subscribe and click the bell button in order to get notified about the upcoming videos. Special thanks to History with Sai, Nico, Chris Ernst, Panayotis Yiannopoulos, Fred Leckie, Tim Lane, ABC Sheikh, Derek Wildstar, Padre91, Vineyard Illuminations, and Estate Care for their continuous support. If you wish to partake in the decision making on the future content and join our Patreon community, feel free to click the link in the video description. This was WanaxTV, and we'll see you again soon.